les perçois.
Oui.
Mais c'est vrai qu'il faut faire attention quand on parle parce que la salle est très sonore.
Ah.
Donc, alors c'est pas la peine de s'approcher trop des micros.
Oui,
Il nous a dit que c'est
que
réglé.
ça marche bien,
Voilà,
alors
voilà.
ça suffit de rester ici.
Tout à fait, voilà.
Sinon, si on touche...
Si on s'empêche trop, ça fait du larcène.
Si. Explode.
Ouais. Ben, on va commencer. Non, parce qu'il m'a dit, il me fait signe qu'ils sont en train de caler à la régie là-haut. Mesdames, Messieurs.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you should be able to hear me. The microphone would seem to be working. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us once again for this third day.
To those who came for the two first days, and welcome to those joining us today for this day of conferences during those international days on the equestrian culture.
Versailles.
Yesterday to today, and today we'll start with 5 presentations. I will give the floor to the first presenter. I'll try to be quite strict
to time as we have 5 presentations
this morning, so we can stick to the program. First of all, presenter, Mr. Paolo Conaglia, professor at the Polytechnic School of Torino. He's a PhD in history of the architectural heritage. I'm sure some of you read his research. He's member of the scientific committee of the research center of the royal residences. He's done several publications, and today he will present for us the royal stables in Torino, hunting and leisure residences, heritage of the city and the region, restoration. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I would like to begin by thanking the Palace of Versailles and the Association of the Royal Residences of Europe and the organisers of the conference for the invitation 18 years after another important conference in Saumur, another centre of equestrian architecture, and after St. Petersburg as well on the same subject, the equestrian heritage of Russia and Europe, a challenge for heritage, the economy, sports, tourism and the environment, coordinated by Pascal Liévaux. Today I would like to talk about the situation and the past of the Piedmont region and Turin for the House of Savoy and the Kingdom of Sardinia by presenting 4 case studies of royal residences of Piedmont, a whole system which was included on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1997. So this system, in which we have these different stables and stud farms, was named at the time the Corona di Delizia, the crown of pleasure, a system of palaces and villas with stables, sometimes with arenas and stud farms, built over the course of 3 centuries to meet the demand of the court of the Duke of Savoy in terms of leisure and recreation and hunting. So here you see paintings showing the palaces in the 17th century. When the city of Turin became the capital of the state in 1563, the Dukes of Savoy sought to create this crown of building by buying land around the city and beginning to build palaces along the rivers, 1, 2 and 3 on the plan here, in the hills, numbers 4 and 5, hunting castles, 8 and 9, and first of all, a large palace in the capital city. To show the close links between the residences in this system and hunting, the best way, but which I can't talk about in detail here, is the hunting map. It's a magnificent topographic map showing the system of residences, the fields, the hunting forests, the different routes, and here you have a part of the map. The first case study is Stupinici. That's the hunting pavilion I'll be presenting now, the role of which required a lot of outbuildings and stables. Today, the pavilion, according to Christian Norberg-Schulz, is the most magnificent hunting palace of Europe from the late Baroque period, with the stables, which were added over the years in the circles, and the rectangles. You can see the stables of the palace built at different periods. It was initially designed as a small hunting pavilion with 2 stables for 60 horses, and during that first work the size of the stables was doubled to take 140 horses. You see on the left the original project with the smaller stables, and then the double stables in the other drawing here. In the mid-18th century, the architect Alfieri proposed a considerable plan for extensions with 8 stables for 345 horses, but which was never built. But it wasn't a dream entirely, because in 1790, using plans by architect Ludovico Beau, they built the new stables, and there was then a capacity for 360 horses. The hunting pavilion was abandoned by the Crown in 1920 and became a Baroque furniture museum, but in the 1980s it was in very poor condition. A series of restoration works was conducted with help of Fiat and began in 1988 on the eastern part in the grand stables, and to create a large exhibition areas, temporary exhibition areas, and also a venue for events. After that, at the beginning of the 2000s, they continued the work on the different outbuildings and the small stables, and here you can see the transformation of the buildings and spaces to host events, banquets, exhibitions, or vehicles. There was also the restoration of a small part where they kept the separations of the original stalls. I should point out, so during the 1990s, some major exhibitions were held in the stables about the city of St. Petersburg, the Empire, and the European Baroque. The restoration of the other stables and apartments was done in 2007 through a network of patrons with the Savings Bank of Turin Foundation and a private group of companies, foundations, insurance companies and banks of Turin, which has a policy of support for heritage and which really is a leader in this area in Italy. The second case study I wanted to present you is the castle of Moncalieri on the hills of Turin, where the arena has been used for many different, sometimes quite amusing things. It was used as a temporary warehouse for paintings and also as a vaccination center for COVID. So different uses over the years. The arena of the castle, a medieval building transformed with galleries and pavilions in the 17th century, was built in 1835 to drawings by Ernest Milano at the far end of the courtyard against the garden wall. In 1920, the castle was given to the army and transformed into barracks, and today it still has this purpose. The Carabinieri are housed here. A small part of the castle is open to visits. Was open to visits a few decades ago, but not the arena. You can't visit this because of the transfer of the collections from the Royal Pinakothek to the Royal Palace and the closure of the museum. The curators decided to use the arena in Moncalieri as a temporary warehouse for works of art. The restoration was carried out thanks to the Society of St. Paul, which gave 3.5 million euros to finance 5 years of work between 2000, which began in 2012-2013. Here you can see the restored building. It was a very large structure, and also the different uses as a warehouse. There were 5,000 artifact paintings, 200 sculptures, and 4,000 engravings which were kept here. After the opening of the new headquarters of the museum, the paintings were removed, which stood empty and was used for sports activities. But after that, during COVID, it was transformed into a vaccination center, a much grander one than many others, and at the same time it was also a contemporary art gallery. So you see the works of arts by a Turin artist on the world, so it served the two purposes, exhibition and vaccination center, at the same time. Thankfully, the COVID situation has got better since. The third case study is the Venaria Reale. This is near, or was near, the city. It's not just a hunting palace, but it serves an architectural, urbanistic, and local role. In this engraving, you see the town with the main street, the Via Maestra, the palace with its outbuildings, the Italian-style garden, and the hunting forests. It was built between 1659 and 1663. And it is the subject of a book published in 1679 by the architect who prepared the project, Count Castellamonte. The text and illustrations provide the detailed description of each part of the building, including the stables. You can see a view of the stables here, and on the right, the plan, the layout of the stables. This system of buildings during the 18th century became, according to a description at the time, the most important of the court residences outside the capital. It was a sort of royal palace out in the countryside. the main country residence of the king, the best decorated, where he was always the keenest to go to spend some of his time. So, we have here a plan showing the property of the domain around the castle. There was more than 1,000 hectares, and it was a whole economic system with the palace, with its garden, then 7 farms with the fields with crops. That's the green circles. And then the hunting forests on the right. And the building called La Mandria, number 8 here on the plan, which was a stud farm for raising, breeding horses. So there was a whole economic system here, which could provide everything necessary for the kitchens of the royal family, bring income, and also breeding of horses. So then there's La Mandria, which is like a second palace alongside Venaria, built in 1708 and extended to drawings by Philippe Juvarat in 1726, and it became the private residence of Victor Emmanuel II and his second wife in 1863. Today, the buildings of La Mandria have been completely restored. You see there the 2 buildings with the grey roof. Those are the arenas from the early 20th century, restored to create a museum initially, but the museum was never created. A museum of landscape, which in fact never opened. So that was a project that was abandoned. So we have these 2 arenas which are empty. And the stable that you see on the left is a part of the apartments of the palace now. So it's no longer a stable. So thanks to the work of several architects from 1700 onwards, the small villa of Venaria of Duke Charles Emmanuel II became the largest of the royal castles. In the second half of the 18th century, they added the gallery, the large stables, the warehouses, the orangery to make a huge ensemble with the different buildings, with the galleries leading through to the stables and the orangery within the palace. In this system, there are the parts that were added by Juvara, the stables and the orangery, which are joined together. It was the architect Juvara who really made Venaria Reale a highlight of equestrian architecture. His work of art is a giant building designed in 1722, combining stables and orangery. And also, if we analyze the building and its position as a theatre set at the end of the longest walkway in the gardens. At Chantilly, there is a view of 400 meters between the window of the prince and the trees next to the reservoir. Here, that axis is 1.5 kilometers long from the facade of the building. It was Montesquieu, on his travels in Italy in 1728, who highlighted the similarities between Venaria and Chantilly, which had been built just beforehand in 1719. And we can also see as an alternative view by Juvara. So here we have Chantilly and the projects for the Venaria. After the fall of the Ancien Régime, and the French invasion in 1798, the palace was abandoned by the court and became an artillery barracks. In the 19th century, all the large areas were converted into stables for the barracks. It really was the royal palace for horses in and around Turin. And the barracks only left after the Second World War. The restoration of the orangery and the stables began only in 1998, based on a project by Paolo Marconi with support from the Italian state, the regional government and the EU. You see here the orangery as it was back in the days when the barracks were here. And here you also see it after the barracks had been abandoned. It's standing empty and in poor condition. And on the right, you see it renovated as an exhibition venue. So here they didn't keep the original function of the building. The cross section of the building shows two twin naves of the building. It was a good idea to resolve the problem of the northern wall of the orangery by playing it against a volume full of horses. That's always the problem of the northern wall of orangery buildings. And with this approach, it is possible to keep the climatic conditions necessary inside the building. So the stables are 150 meters long, 12 meters wide. Chantilly is longer and wider, slightly, with a height of 15 meters approximately, north facing, lit with 12 lanterns, and according to the drawings it was possible to house about 160 horses here, but according to the documents for the payment, it indicated that there were 200 stalls. The stalls have disappeared, but we know from the drawings that the stalls were 1 meter 40 wide and 3 meters 15 long. At Versailles, it's 1 meter 30 wide, but shorter. So this here, it's very slightly longer and wider, but I don't know what the technical reasons are for that. Those are the dimensions anyway. The restoration of the grand stables was completed in 2006. It opened in 2010 as an exhibition venue and was included in the visits to the museum in 2012. So here you see the stables before they were restored. And today you have this boat which is there, which was used for travelling on the River Po during certain festivities and celebrations. The other institution which shares the Venaria Reale with the museum is the Centre for Conservation and Restoration. The work done by Alfieri in the outbuildings began in 1757 with the storage buildings, and in 1760 with two new stable buildings, 13 meters wide, 72 meters long, designed for 82 horses each. We should say that if we look at the architecture treatises of the times, the dimensions of stables generally were smaller, so a double stable usually is 8 meters, and here, like at Chantilly and Versailles and in the royal residences, the mentality really was to do something bigger and beyond the reasonable, normal dimensions of such buildings, with huge vaulting. And buildings of this size aren't necessarily what you need for horses, but it's important, obviously, to show their power. It was designed, therefore, for 82 horses each, facing east-west, and the original project planned that there would be accommodation for 330 horses, approximately, with two other small stables to be built, but they were never built, which would increase the capacity to 430 horses. The hunting here in the months of May and June in the 1770s involved 200 horses and 150 dogs. In the 1990s, the small stables were in ruins, as you can see on the photograph on the right. The restoration was completed in 2004. The architect for that was Pierre Desrossi, to transform this into a centre for restoring works of art. This is Desrossi's project that you can see here on the screen. The Conservation and Restoration Centre in the small stables in the west and the east. In the west stables you have a conference room and classrooms, and on the east you have laboratories and classrooms upstairs. In the arena you also have an area for restoring outsized works of art. And this was done pretty much without touching the structure of the building. Here you can see the project and the photographs of the finished result. The small laboratories, the conference room and the offices. Here you have the original plans of the arena. A room that is 19 meters wide, 60 meters long, with structures at each end, and today this is where the large restoration laboratories are for large paintings, furniture and sculptures. So the Centre for Conservation and Restoration was inaugurated in 2005 and serves for research in these areas. There is a foundation run by the Ministry for Culture, the Regional Government of Piedmont, the City of Turin, the University and Polytechnic School of Turin, and the Foundation for Art of the Society of St. Paul. You'll see that the Society of St. Paul really is a sort of deus ex machina which manages this system. In 2013, the Restoration Centre restored the gallery of the Farnese Palace, the French Embassy in Rome. And now for the conclusion. The final case study is the centre of the system, the Cavallerizza, which is actually the name of the arena, but often it's the name that's used for the whole building. So the Cavallerizza of Turin in 1673, when the city was extended eastwards, they began work to create a system of buildings at the service of the royal palace, linked to a new great gallery, as we can see in this engraving, with the theatre, Royal Academy, stables, arena, mint, storage and customs. Only the academy and the 4 stables were actually built in the 17th century. The octagonal arena, theatre and gallery, for them only the foundations were built, and it was only in the following centre that the system was more or less completed, with the building of the archives and the ministries, and on part of the foundations for the gallery. In another engraving here we see the part we're interested in, with the stables and the cross with the 4 stables. According to the architect's description, it's the same system proposed by Leonardo da Vinci, with the octagon in the middle, 18 meters. The 4 stables were supposed to house 50 horses each, with vaulted rooms 11 meters long and 11 meters wide, 40 meters long. In 1740, one of the stables was demolished to build the new large arena, to a design by Alfieri, 18 meters wide and 68 meters long, compared to 18 by 55 meters in Vienna, flanked by lodges and a vault which was 13 meters wide, a work of art, and the guides of Turin talk about this immense ancient style vault. But this was only partly built, with a room 18 meters wide and 37 meters long. You see on the drawing here the part that was actually built, with the apartments for the pages above. The ensemble was completed under the reign of Charles Albert in 1832 with the construction of new stables and storage buildings to a design by architect Charles Bernard Mosca. The complex of stables and arenas lost its role when the capital was transferred to Rome, and because of the fall of the monarchy after the Second World War, these huge spaces were put to little use and almost neglected. It formed really a hole in the center of the city, a gap in the center of the city. However, in 1997, they were admitted to the UNESCO World Heritage List. The large arena, which had become a garage for police cars for several decades, was converted into a theatre in 2004, but then it was completely abandoned in 2013. And you see this system of buildings now is right in the center of the city, between the theatre, the Royal Opera, the university, the radio and television concert hall, the radio headquarters building. It really is a part of a whole system dedicated to culture. But the plans for the buildings and the cultural policy of the city have changed direction several times. In 2003, the city of Turin decided to buy the whole ensemble in two phases. It was already public property, but it didn't belong to the city, to put it to cultural uses as an exhibition venue, museum. But in 2009, because of the municipal debt, the council had to give up on buying the second phase and put the first phase that it had bought up for sale. Nobody showed any interest in buying it between 2009 and 2017. It was huge and too difficult to manage, so the city therefore made a choice, but it was a political error. It wasn't possible to separate the parts of a system which is meant to be one, right in the middle of the city. So in 2014, the stables and Cavallerizza were occupied by the 1445 Assembly, which fights against the municipal policy and which organizes exhibitions, alternative exhibitions in the venue. The following year, the municipality began to reverse its political decisions and to give up on selling the arena. Here, however, the university did build facilities. But finally, a solution was found for all the buildings. In 2021, the foundation of the Society of St. Paul and the university bought a large part of this complex to establish its headquarters there, but in a way that respects the public nature and the character of the site. There was an architecture competition organized, which was won by Chinozuki, and the work began, and the inauguration is scheduled for 2026. I don't know if that will be the case, but the work is ongoing. Here you have some views of the plans for the project with the headquarters of the Society of St. Paul, but combined with the university, it's a sort of cultural hub for the city, if you like. And there are two last parts of the Cavallerizza which have been separated. The part on the left still belongs is public, but belongs to another institution, which is to be converted into a hotel. And the red part here is to be converted into a cultural center and a training center for the Fine Arts Academy and School for very upmarket, high-end training activities. But anyway, there is now a clear policy for the use of the buildings, and we can imagine that in 2026 or perhaps a bit later, everything will be in place. But in conclusion, I've told you a story without any horses, but it shows it is possible to restore these buildings, to give them other uses. But it's a shame to lose this link with the original function. There is a sort of happy ending for the Venaria Reale and La Mandria, where a farm was restored in 2001 as the International Centre for Horses. And in 2007, it hosted the European Dressage Championships, but the institution went bankrupt. It was empty for a year or two, but today there is a cooperative and a sports association which are working with the Association for the Promotion of Equestrian Tourism, and they have taken over management of the centre. So now it's no longer the International Centre for the Horse, it's just a centre of 40 hectares with a 4,000 square metre arena, 64 boxes for horses, fields and areas with sand, and 6 paddocks. But it's a simple project, but at least this is in line with the original purpose of the site. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that paper, which raises some genuine questions about the use of these buildings and ensemble, in particular around Turin. We're going to hand over now to Stefano Gei, an architect from Frederick II University of Naples, who's been working at the Royal Palace since 2001 as a curator, and he's going to talk about the Royal Palace of Naples and the use of its spaces for the Royal Cavalry. So here we continue in Italy. Stefano.
Okay, merci. Bonjour à tous. Show you the 2 significant examples of reuse and valorization strategies that the museum has implemented in recent years to improve the museum's offer to the public, while at the same time enhancing spaces of great historical and architectural charm that bear witness the equestrian activities that once took place in the palace. In its 400 years of history, the Royal Palace of Naples has undergone many architectural and functional transformations. And in the following image, I want to briefly show you what the Royal Cavalry service activities were and where they were carried out within the monumental complex. It is worth noting the strong symbolic connection of the horse with the history of Naples. In fact, as early as the 13th century, a prancing horse was chosen by the Swabian kings as the symbol of the city of Naples, because it represented the impetuousness of the Neapolitan people. For this reason, the figure of the horse as a symbol of the Kingdom of Naples recurs in many decorations of the royal palace. Here we see, for example, the white stucco vault of the staircase of honor and the detail of the horse, the symbol of Naples. The palace was only provided with ample space for the royal cavalry in the 18th century, when Naples became the capital of an autonomous kingdom under Charles of Bourbon. In 1734, Charles of Bourbon implemented a reforming policy that to take the form of the reclamation of the plains in the plan for a new capital in Caserta, and in the construction of the so-called city reali, royal cities, royal residences used for recreation and hunting, and in some cases, centers for manufacturing and livestock breeding. Charles of Bourbon identified the territory of Persano about 100 kilometers south of Naples, as a suitable place to build a hunting lodge and to establish a horse farm there. His aim was to use a new and faster breed of horses to modernize the military cavalry. From the crossing of local horses with Turkish and Spanish horses was born the valuable breed of horses called Persano. This breed of horses was also bred at another royal site. Not far from the royal palace of Caserta, the royal site of Carditello was built as an establishment for breeding horses, buffaloes and cows, and for processing dairy products. Carditello is an interesting fusion between of a royal residence and a farm. In the picture, we can see the gallops still present in front of the residence. Back talking about the Royal Palace of Naples, in this plan we can see in red color the extension of the palace commissioned by Bourbon kings. On the left side we can recognize the theater of San Carlo, with its typical horseshoe-shaped hall, and attached perpendicularly the building of the cavalry riding school. Here. Which no longer exists. In the center above, attached to the 17th century palace shown in black in the drawing, we see the so-called Braccio Nuovo, the new wing, an L-shaped building, this one, intended to house the apartments for the princes with the royal stables on the ground floor. In the section of the same collection of drawings belonged to the collections of the Victoria and Albert Museum, we can see in detail on the ground floor the stables with the rows of troughs positioned below the royal apartment. Here, the stables. In this more detailed information can be found in a plan published in 1833, drawn by French architects Parcier and Fontaine, contained in an atlas preserved in the National Library, which is located inside the Royal Palace of Naples itself, and which collects the plans of the royal residences in France, Italy, Spain, and Russia. The stables for carriage horses are shown in red, the stables for saddle horses in green, and in yellow you can see the stable for transport mules, the carriage house in blue, the saddlery in purple, and in orange you can see the fodder stores. The covered riding school is indicated in water green color on the left. This distribution of function is also documented in a model from 1811 on display at the Royal Palace, where is evident the situation of construction disorder that characterized the palace at the beginning of the 19th century. In this picture, we see the northern side of the Royal Palace, where is the San Carlo Theatre in the center, and to the sides, the covered ride school, this one, and the old Viceroyal Palace on the right, are leaning against each other. In background is the Royal Palace, and on the left we see the wing that housed the stables on the ground floor. In 1840s, during the reign of the Ferdinand II of Bourbon, it was finally decided to renovate the entire palace, as optimizing the various functions that took place in the building, including those related to the royal cavalry. The author of the restoration project was court architect Gaetano Genovese, who gave a new order to the entire monumental complex, as can be seen by comparing the plans before and after the restoration. All portions characterized by architectural disorder were demolished, in particular the old Viceroyal Palace, the covered riding school, and the nearby buildings, while on the southern side, the facade was rectified and in the new building was placed the carriage house. On the north side, the romantic garden was created and the new stables were placed underground. Two bronze groups of horses with grooms, donated in 1846 by Tsar Nicholas I to Ferdinand II Bourbon, were placed at the main entrance gate of the royal garden. The sculptures were made by the Russian artist of German origin, Piotr Karlovich Claude von Jagensberg, who specialized in the creation of equestrian groups. At the end of the 19th century, the equestrian statues were moved to their current location, where a new covered riding school was built, the yellow building we can see. Today, the riding school is used as the headquarters of a sport club and doesn't belong to the museum, but we hope that it could be recovered as part of the history of the Royal Palace in the future. Opposite the riding school, in an underground space under the royal garden, in this image on the left, are the stables, an example of a reuse and enhancement implemented by the Royal Palace management in recent years to improve our offer to the public. The stables are characterized by large vaulted space in which the limestone troughs are arranged. They are still preserved, as well as the water drainage system in the lava stone floors. The impressive room have been restored and now house the Time Gallery, a permanent exhibition area where visitors are taken on a journey through some 2,500 years of the history of the city of Naples. The layout of the Time Gallery is organized in thematic sections covering the main chronological periods of the city's history. Along the way, multimedia installation and video projections illustrate the urban evolution of the city and its history, making the experience engaging and evocative for visitors. The Time Gallery includes a selection of original works from the city, mainly from churches, each documenting a phase of the history of Naples. Of great interest are the archaeological finds found in the excavation of construction sites of the Naples Metro, where the remains of the sanctuary of Olympic Games were discovered. On display in the museum are marble slabs on which the lists of the winners of the games are engraved. Another example of a reuse and enhancement implemented by the management of a royal palace is the carriage house, a large vaulted space built in neo-Doric style, accessible from the carriage courtyard. In this picture, we see it as it was a few years ago, when it was used for storage and on occasion for temporary exhibitions. Since 2022, the carriage house has been undergoing renovation works and now houses the Caruso Museum, the first national museum dedicated to Enrico Caruso, one of the greatest tenors of all time, born in Naples, which was inaugurated on 19th of July 2023. The museum was conceived as an immersive space in which visitors can interact with multimedia platforms, music and film stations. Through the use of a smartphone and headphones, you can make a journey into the life of the famous tenor, accompanied by several recordings of his voice. Also on display is a selection of original works, coming mainly from the donation of Luciano Pituello, a great collector of Caruso memorabilia, costumes, records, vintage gramophones, original sheet music with the tenor's autograph marks, and also drawings, caricatures, and watercolors made by the tenor himself. To conclude, I'd like to show you some pictures of the contemporary art installation that can be seen in the Romantic Garden of the Royal Palace since 2010. The site-specific work was conceived by the artist Mimmo Palladino and leaves the mark of a strong symbolic link that once existed between horses and the palace. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. J, for this presentation about the Royal Palace in Naples. Je propose, si vous avez des...
If you have questions, I suggest you can ask them now before we take a small break. In English, please, for Mr. J, and Paolo in French.
Est-ce qu'il y a un micro dans la salle, s'il vous plaît?
We have a microphone in the room.
It's okay, it's okay. We have a micro.
Thank you so much. You just made my day to say that there is a new Caruso museum in this. I'm a big fan of Caruso. I mean, I have to take a plane immediately. It's so fantastic. Thank you. I just wanted to bring a short correction. The Turkish blood is actually the Neapolitan courser. That is, I think, is actually Byzantine. When the Byzantines fell down, Constantinople was taken. Alfonso from Trastamara and his son Ferrante opened Campania and Apulia and let all the Stradioti in, that were the Byzantine army actually, the Albanese army. So that is when the Neapolitan courser is created, and it is Byzantine, probably even Nicaean blood. The Persano horse, unfortunately, has Achalteke blood, actually the English blood. So that is the end of the famous Neapolitan horse. And as much as admire Charles of Bourbon, he's a fantastic king of Naples, but he goes back to Madrid with 18 Neapolitan horses and creates there a caballerizza just for Neapolitan horses that are mixed then into the Spanish blood. So that is, the end, basically, of the real famous Neapolitan horse. There is, however, now one person in Naples that tries to recreate the Neapolitan horse. That is Mr. Giuseppe Maresca, and he is since a while trying to find a place where to go with his horses. So if you need still some horses to put in your place there, in your palazzo, that would be fantastic, to bring the Neapolitan horse back. That was the horse of Renaissance and early Baroque, the Neapolitan horse. You were famous. And it's so sad also for Torino to see that there is no big riding tradition in Italy anymore. But you were the beginning. You were the beginning of the real art, Galeazzo Sanseverino and Pietro del Monte. That was the glory of the horse was actually in Italy. So, recovering these spaces would be fantastic. And just to end with a little request to Mr. Stefano J, if ever you know that, there was a cavallerizza created by the Spanish vice king in 1581 in Naples. Is there still anything that remains from it? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. D'autres questions? Oui.
C'est la réponse.
Pour la réponse.
Okay.
Allez-y.
No, just to reply to your question, I'm the director of the Royal Palace of Naples. So, but in 1581, you said? So it was probably the old Viceroyal Palace, which was demolished and then enlarged in the 17th century and then demolished. So I don't think we know anything about the stables or horses. I mean, at least we didn't find any evidence of the presence of horses before the construction of the Royal Palace in the 1600. So, well, we will. Thank you.
It was actually a copy. It's called Cavallerizza for the Spanish name, because the Spanish Felipe II had already created in Cordoba the Cavallerizzas Reales. And the Spanish do the same in Naples. What is a bizarre thing, right? I mean, actually, you are the beginning of art orchestra. You have invented all that. But you do this basically in the space of the city center. You know, there is a very famous painting from Mica Spadaro that's in private possession, where you see someone giving lessons in front of the walls of the city and Piazza Dante today.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was always looking for a space, like, where did you actually invent this? And you don't find anything. You did this just, you know, in the field beside the house. That is so bizarre. But if you know more, please.
Actually, as you noticed, we started from the Bourbon Kings, so we didn't mention the viceroyal period or even earlier. So it would be interesting for us. It was easier for us to show what we can identify now. So that's previous history. So, but any information is welcome. Thank you. J'ai une question pour Paolo.
I have a question for Paolo. May I? I saw that you mentioned Luvara, the project for the Venaria stables sent to the King of Naples. 1785. The Naples court asked for a register of the buildings of the court of Sardinia, and the architects and from the Office of Buildings and Fortresses prepared cases or albums of drawings with a leather cover. Not copper, leather. There was one copy in Torino, but a copy was found in Naples in the library of the Engineering University. Bucaro found it. There was a symposium on Alfieri about 10 years ago. They were presented. They did a register and kept a copy in Torino and sent the other one to Naples. So it's about all the buildings of the Royal Venerie, but in Naples, 2 engravings were sent as well. These were cards, business cards, of the court from Stupinigi. There were painted engravings with a very nice sculpted and golden frame sent to Naples, but also to other European courts. I don't know about the other ones, whether they're in all the palaces, but there was a series of drawings sent to Naples in order to share this knowledge around architecture in general, not just about the staples. So we'll take a break now, and we can continue the discussions, or you can, around over a coffee. And we'll meet again in 10 minutes. Thank you.
10h30 donc, merci.
10:30.
Mesdames, Messieurs, nous allons reprendre. Merci.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to resume. So, we're going to listen to Mrs. Menot, who's going to give a presentation of the Le Pin Stud Farm, the Haras National du Pin. She's in charge of the project to redevelop that. She's an art historian and a specialist in equestrian tourism. So I'll hand over to you. Hello, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the Palace of Versailles and the Cultural Development Department and Karine Macrath, with whom I have the pleasure of working, as we have a cultural cooperation agreement between the Palace and the Haras National du Pin, which is easy to understand because the Haras stud farm would not be there if it hadn't been for Louis XIV. So just to know where it is, it's in the Orne, not very far from Versailles, about 1.25 hours to the south of Caen and north of Le Mans. So Versailles and equestrian culture yesterday and today, and we're going to talk about heritage and transmission of equestrian culture. This is, the Haras is a national stud form, so we're going to be talking about the development of this equestrian heritage. Of course, I wanted to begin with an image of Louis XIV, which you have already seen. Louis XIV crowned by victory by Pierre Mignard. They needed horses for warfare and for other purposes. And here is a view of the Haras du Pin, the stud form, out in the countryside. We didn't have the courts of the king and the queen, but a lot of 17th century landscaping work was done, and it was built in the 18th century, but it really is inspired to some extent by Versailles and its architecture. We have a portrait here of Louis XIV, but it's a copy. Quite simply, because Napoleon III came to visit the stud form and offered this copy of the painting for two reasons. First of all, as a tribute to Louis XIV, Napoleon III wanted also to establish his power by offering this sort of portrait, a political gift, if you like. So some images of horses, although we don't have many of them today. I come back to what our colleague from Italy was saying. What do we do with these former stud farms where once there were horses? Do we keep them or not? It's a whole discussion we could have, but I wanted to begin by a few pictures of these plough horses which we have and which are part of our animal heritage. And these breeds of horse and donkey would be no longer part of our heritage. If there hadn't been stud farms like this one, we still have them today at the Haras du Pin. The decision to create the royal stud farms dates back to Louis XIII. There were already stud farms. The kings of France had their own horses, and notably these horses from North Africa and Libya, which were a bit taller and more sturdy than the Arab thoroughbreds. And the organization of equestrian breeding by the royal stud farms in the 17th century was necessary to provide horses for the kingdom and no longer rely on imports for war, in particular from Germany. The war horses generally tended to be imported from Germany, and the Spanish horses imported from Spain and Portugal were often used for pleasure and for hunting, also from North Africa and Italy. So equestrian breeding at the start of the 17th century, there were some regional centres, especially in Normandy, but the second half of the 17th century, they needed to find a solution because there was a crisis in equestrian production. There weren't enough horses in France, and horses were essential for training, for farming, for transport, for recreation, for hunting, also for shows, although obviously there weren't carousels every day at Versailles, and also for fighting. The first attempt to create royal stud farms was made by Louis XIII in 1630 and taken up by Louis XIV and Colbert, with a ruling of the Council of State being issued in 1665 for the creation of royal stud farms as a strategic focus for the monarchy. In 1665, the first king's stud farm was set up near Versailles in Saint-Légion-Yvelines. It was a failure because of the health conditions for the mares, catastrophic conditions, and also there was a lot of hunting on the site. And we know that for the reproduction of horses, you need calm, peaceful conditions, and that really wasn't the case. Also, in terms of authority, in 1686, the king's stud farm was directly under the Grand Equerry of Versailles. So without Versailles, there wouldn't be an Arras du Pin stud farm. So the king's stud farm, the Arras du Pin, was the first royal stud farm. So at that time, as it wasn't possible to have this near Versailles, they needed to find another location, and it's François Gédéon de Garceau, captain of the King's Stud Farm, who went searching around France in 1714 to find the site. It went very quickly. The forest of M was chosen. That's where Le Pin is. There had already been royal animal breeding in the region previously. Philippe le Bel of Burgundy had a stud farm nearby back in medieval times. The transfer of the Arras du Pin was made officially in April 1715, so it went very quickly, just 1 year after beginning the search, just a few months before the death of Louis XIV. So even though the creation of the royal stud farms was a decision of Louis XIV, he did not ever set foot at the Arras du Pin. It was under the reign of Louis XV that it developed. This was the first stud farm among the many, the 23 that were created in the 19th century. So the organization of the stud farms followed the Colbert tradition, with a central organization. Like all the public stud farms, the Arras du Pin became an imperial stud farm under the emperor, then republican and national. The institution of the stud farms was questioned over the years and through the 1990s, and finally it became a technical institute, the IFCE, the French Institute for the Horse and Horse Riding. So I wanted to show you this image with Louis XV, this equestrian portrait which is at Versailles, and also this notebook showing the Arras du Pin seen from Louis XIV promenade by Edgar Degas, who came to the region and saw it. And he does note here on the page, although it's not easy to read, he says that the stud farm dates back to Louis XV. So it was Robert de Cotte who prepared the design for the Arras du Pin. He was the first architect to the king, who had taken over from Mansart at Versailles. And the drawings, the plans, the originals can be found at the National Archives. We're lucky that we have color drawings with the main building, which is called the Arras du Pin Palace or Castle. So here you have a slightly broader view of the approach to the castle and the castle there. I'll speak to you about the domain and the more than 1,000 hectares. There is the Gate of Honor there on the right with the horse's head. It's not as grand as the Gateway of Honor at Versailles, but still. And I also wanted to show this portrait of Napoleon III, who inaugurated the Le Pin racecourse, which is also on the site. Here you only see a part of the estate. So here it's just the beginnings from Charles Daniel Trudaine's Atlas, Road Atlas of France at the time, and you only see part of the historic center. The red lines show the buildings of the stud farm. On the right and left, the stables, the main building. Behind that, the terraces, and then the vegetable gardens, which we're trying to recreate. There's a project underway for that, which I'll talk about later. And then that walkway, the Allée Louis XIV, that runs through the trees from the palace. And here you have this plan showing the estate, dating back to 1796, bearing in mind that most of the buildings had been built between 1715 and 1730, and bottom right, indicated by hand, everything which is surrounded or circled in red is the Haras du Pin, and in yellow is the land yet to be acquired or purchased. And it's very precise. You can see the pasture land for the mares, and then for the stallions to the bottom right. And above you have the forest of Courgeron, top left, with the royal road running through it. It's no longer like that. It goes just in front of the stud farm, but that royal road ran through the northern part of the forest on this drawing. So it really was an area dedicated to breeding. There were up to 200 stallions when the stud farm was at its height. So the horses began to be used less and less, and then not at all in transport, agriculture and warfare, although they continue to be used for equestrian sports and races, also to be used by the general public for horse riding. And today the horse is starting to be used again a little in farming, in certain vineyards in Romanée-Conti, for example, where they have sustainable development policies because the horse damages the soil less than the tractor. But despite this decreased use, horse breeding continues in this #1 region in France for horse breeding, Normandy, and Le Haras du Pin is the symbol of this and still has a few horses. In the 1990s, there were still 80 stallions of 10 different breeds. They're plough horses, racing horses, and horses for sports purposes. As demand has increased for recreational horse riding, the site has been doing more and more communication with the general public. I've been working at the Haras du Pin for many years, and 25 years ago we started some communication targeting the general public, but it really has developed over the years. In the 1980s, the director of the time, François Charpy, I think it was. In fact, there had always been a procession of carriages after the races that were held at the Haras du Pin, and the director decided to create Le Pin Thursdays with equestrian shows for the general public. This was the first time that it really opened to the public. Visits were organized gradually by the grooms working at the stud farm. Then there was a turning point in the 1990s as the horse breeding sector opened up a little more, and the Haras du Pin, the stud farm also, with its staff organizing guided visits. And then with the Horse and Heritage Association, I'd like to pay tribute to Philippe de Quatrebarbe, who is here. And it's thanks to him that the Haras du Pin really opened up to the public from 1994 through to 2015. Also, thanks to Philippe de Quatrebarbe and the local politicians and Chamber of Commerce, and their networks, they all joined forces locally to develop the stud farm, working closely also with the staff working on the horses to promote the skills that were present there. And little by little, this local association, which was created to develop the Haras du Pin, developed a range of tourist products and cultural activities with the opening of a museum area and a shop in 2006. So that continued through to 2015. In 2016, the national stud farms were struggling, and the authorities wanted to take over the Haras du Pin. Sorry, I have to speed up. So it was the public authorities that took over, who created a major project to develop it as a heritage site, as breeding activities came to an end. But often when a company loses its activity, there are efforts to keep the heritage, the different forms of heritage. And heritage, the whole notion of heritage has been transformed in recent years with tangible and intangible heritage. And this applies also to the equestrian sector. It was to take about 20 years with 3 key days. 1994, a report by Senator Larcher on animal heritage, rural heritage. Then the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention of UNESCO, which was important for the equestrian sector. Then 2011, with French tradition riding, which was listed as intangible heritage of UNESCO. So here you have some more photographs. The work, you can see the work here being done on the walls and the roof and inside the chateau since 2016. Gradually, this equestrian heritage has received more attention with the buildings and the furnishings associated with it. They've continued renovating the buildings. There's been a multi-year program to restore the furnishings of the site. But this equestrian and animal and environmental heritage is sometimes difficult to address for different political or budget reasons. And at this point, equestrian heritage has to be seen as a potential vector for economic development and also to pass on skills. So it's a long, this development of this heritage, this transmission of this heritage is a long and complex process. In particular, this whole relationship between humans and horses. But there are also many links in heritage. It's a whole ecosystem with the people, the environment, the architecture, the objects, the animals, and all the knowledge and know-how associated with this. And access to heritage status has made it easier to recognize this equestrian heritage. So how is all this organized at the Haras du Pin? There is a budget now for conservation and multi-year programs for the furnishings and buildings. The transmission aspect is organized through training for different audiences, both public and private sector, and also there's promotion of tourism activities. Our grand project has been underway since 2020, focusing on tourism, the equestrian sector, sport and training. So here you have some photographs of the saddle maker who has a workshop there at Le Pin, which is independent. But she was trained at the IFCE. So this is an important technique and know-how. The restoration work is also underway. There are also the stables of the hippodrome. There is Saint-Ouen Église in Vieux-Pin, bottom right. And the infirmary and stable of Carmarthen. All of these are also part of the restoration work. And for the upcoming projects, there's a possibility of working on other historic buildings. There's the arena, the Manège d'Or arena, built in the 18th century, which is to benefit from work. Also, there were some former outlying sites with houses and other breeding facilities, which are now going to be converted into gîtes and bed and breakfasts. And Also, the estate, other work is going to be done on the estate. Here you have the International Centre for Equestrian Sport, which was inaugurated last year. 24 million euros budget there. International competitions have already been held there, notably in carriage driving. And they also want to make this a leading destination in France for rural tourism. And also the creation of a training campus in synergy with the IFCE to pass on all these skills and know-how which continue to exist through training courses. These skills which we have in Normandy and elsewhere, also in partnership with the veterinary schools. And here they have just renovated a site from the time of Napoleon III, which is used for training. So training activities which are being developed, and a national centre for training in equine risk. And here the last pictures. This is the Cité Pont-Avis, which has been totally renovated, dating back to Napoleon III, which will have accommodation, catering, training rooms. And the Haras du Pin today has shows, it has carriages and vehicles on display, sports activities, but there's still a lot remaining to be done. Always with the aim being that the most important thing is to have horses there. We're working on the renovation of saddles, textile saddles, for example, from Abzac, from Versailles. But what's the point in having the saddles if we don't have the riders, if we don't have the horses? And how today can we communicate about this with the general public? It may be possible through different forms of communication, but a lot is still to be done, but I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Thank you for that excellent example, and that then brings us to this question of the equestrian life of yesterday and today, with this gradual transformation over the years in the stud farms. I know there are still lots of issues pending in this area, lots of work to be done. Thank you for that very fine example. We're going to hand over now. We're going to change the order of the presentations. I apologize for this, but we have someone who has to leave soon. So if Sally Goodsir from London, from the Royal Mews, could come and join us on the stage to give her presentation. And for the questions, we will be having the questions at the end of this presentation. So Madame Menot has to leave us now, but we'll be back this afternoon if you have any questions for her, any more precise questions about the different work she talked about there, the transformation work, the whole heritage aspect, and the different skills and professions, and also the activities to receive tourists and the general public, which is one of the key focuses of the development efforts at the Haras du Pin. Thank you very much.
It's yours. It's okay. And you use this? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody, and I'm going to be speaking in English, and I'd like to thank the translators in advance for their help to me, both on my own headphones and what you're listening to right now. The English word for a town's stables, a mews, comes from the change of plumage which hunting falcons undergo seasonally. Those falcons were first kept by Saxon kings over 1,000 years ago in England. The word itself is French in origin, from the word meut, to change, molt, or shed feathers. Falconry was an essential part of a young nobleman's upbringing, alongside riding, but when the birds of prey were molting, they had to be kept inside, they couldn't be used. These early mews would physically move with the monarch as they moved around southern England to whichever palace they were resident at, along with the rest of the royal household. So it's a very transient institution at that time. In the 13th century, we have our first trace in London of a permanent royal stable. This accommodation was still mostly for falcons, but also combined equestrian facilities. They were first at Bloomsbury, which is now part of North London, but then would have been a separate village, and then later at Charing Cross, now perhaps best known as the name for a station, but it was originally the site of the royal stables. Charing Cross was close to the premier royal palaces at that time, at Westminster, which is now best known as the seat of the UK government, and at Whitehall, now where the British Civil Service operate, but they were both the royal palaces at that time. In 1762, George III purchased Buckingham House, perhaps best known to us all now as Buckingham Palace, as a private residence for his wife, Queen Charlotte, and their growing family. They eventually had 15 children, and moved some of the royal horses down the road to just behind Buckingham House, just for their own private use. But at this time, the stables still remained at Charing Cross. At Buckingham House, as well as a very small private stable, George III commissioned a brand new riding school. There was no large riding school at Charing Cross, and in 1764, just as he was coming to the throne, he commissioned a riding school, possibly built by the architect William Chambers, who had taught him draftsmanship and architecture, but we have no proof, so if anybody ever comes across a plan, please let us know. A Serlian window at the east end, which is what we're looking at across the photograph here, attached to the piano nobile, the premier floor of the palace. So it would have enabled equestrian demonstrations to be watched by the elite visitors and perhaps the king and queen themselves, looking down onto the sand surface of the school, but directly from their own rooms in the palace. The Gold State coach was also his other great equestrian commission, something that you might recognise from the coronation of King Charles III last year. It was intended for George III's coronation, but... Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Sorry. It was intended for George III's coronation, but as with so many government projects, it went very much over time and over budget and was only delivered 2 years later. It was delivered straight to the stables at Charing Cross, not to the stables at Buckingham House. And the first evening it was delivered, they tried it with 8 of the Hanoverian cream horses, where it was found to go well and the coachmen were pleased with it. The only accident that happened on that first outing was due to the tensions, perhaps, in the structure. One of the windows cracked and had to be very quickly replaced. It has been used for every British coronation since that of William IV in 1831, including, as I mentioned, last year for King Charles III. In keeping with its place as the most prestigious of the British royal coaches, it's still used with 8 pale-coloured horses, no longer Hanoverian creams, but now a type kept by the British monarchy called the Windsor Grey, which is a type, not a breed. The box seat, the original coachman's seat, was removed for a coronation in 1902, but since then it has been postilion-driven, solely postilion-driven. In 1820, the accession of George III's son as George IV heralded a huge building project at Buckingham Palace, and this turned what was a relatively private, smaller house into part of the palace that you might recognise today. The area around the mews at Charing Cross was becoming extremely built up, and therefore it was decided that there would be a new quadrangle, a stable quadrangle, built behind Buckingham Palace in the southern edge of the garden, and that's what you can see on the map here. Right beside the lake of the garden, but with very minimal garden access, but very good access into local roads, which of course was what was needed for the logistics of royal transport. Parliament granted £48,000 to build the new quadrangle. Again, it went slightly over budget. The whole of the Buckingham Palace site is quite wet. There is a stream that runs directly underneath it. So there had to be a lot of work done on the foundations, and it eventually cost about 50% more than the government had originally granted to the king. So they were working within an existing structure of roads, putting a new stable quadrangle beside existing London roads. And therefore, the site is quite interesting in that as soon as you leave the quadrangle, you are out on a public road. So this is one of the carriages leaving the main quadrangle and entering Buckingham Palace Road. The royal business, of course, can involve late nights and early mornings. So in that photograph, you can see a house, the brick building on the right, which was built as a house for the gatekeepers and for the clerk of the Crown stable, which today the job title is Crown Equerry, and that is the person responsible for the day-to-day running of the mews. So this idea of a level of security and a level of gatekeeping to stop the general public perhaps getting into the royal stables when the roads are so very close. Through the arch in the previous photograph, a large quadrangle was designed, and this was a stable design echoed for several centuries in Britain and elsewhere, as we have seen, as suitable for the accommodation of horses, carriages, and in this case also for staff. The coach houses were designed on the east side, which is where the photograph has been taken from. And we are looking across the quadrangle at a row of carriage houses and stables on the far side here, along with modern staff car parking. So there is still that tension between modern use and historic objects. We have the start of a small procession here lining up with the horse boxes and the staff cars. On the first floor level, you may be able to see doors and windows. So this was designed as staff accommodation for equestrian staff and for others. There are therefore no upper haylofts in the Royal Mews. It is still lived in by families and by individual members of staff whose jobs in the royal household mean that they need to be on site at different hours, particularly early mornings and late nights. Then they have accommodation in the Royal Mews. And there are wives, husbands, small children live there. So it's a real community still. It's like a little village in the middle of London. Today, it's about 150 people live at the Mews, and in the 19th century, there were so many people it actually had its own school. Queen Victoria allowed for the payment of a school teacher to pay a salary. The Royal Mews today is part of the Lord Chamberlain's office, so one of 5 offices paid for by the British government as part of the sovereign grant to operate the monarchy. The Lord Chamberlain's office includes the Mews, it includes the body that looks after the honours system in Britain, some of the diplomatic staff and so forth. So it's part of a much bigger machinery, perhaps. Within the Royal Mews, the current staff structure is about 170 years old, and some job titles are much older than that. So the Master of the Horse, and you can see we've just changed the Master of the Horse, so we don't have a photograph of the new one, but this gentleman, Lord de Morley, was the Master during the coronation, so that's him in his full kit for that event. He holds a job title that is an honorary position, but generally comes with equestrian interest or equestrian knowledge, and he rides now only to ceremonial occasions. He's not involved in the day-to-day operation of the stables. At the bottom, if you read early iterations of the conference programme, you might have thought that Toby Brown was going to speak. Toby, unfortunately, has been unwell recently, but Toby operates as the Crown Equerry, so he looks after the day-to-day running of the stables, and I'm just here in his place. But there's a very cheeky Cleveland Bay horse putting its tongue out at a very senior member of the royal household staff. And Toby came to us with equestrian knowledge. He was the commanding officer of the household cavalry before he came to the household just over 10 years ago. So he runs the horse transport and also the motor transport for the royal family. Air and rail is a different department. As with many of the functions of the royal family in Britain, different events take place at different palaces. And at Windsor, there are also facilities, although they're not open to the public and I think are probably less well known. But quiet roads in a private part of the home park outside the castle, which enable young horses to be schooled. There is also an 1839 riding school built by a British government architect, which again is very good for bringing on the young horses. It's very quiet, quite different from the school at Buckingham Palace, where there's a busy main road that goes past it. And also from Windsor, quite a well-known in Britain annual race meeting at Royal Ascot. And every day of the race meeting is preceded by a royal procession. So the King, or formerly the Queen, and the royal family and some of their guests process down the racecourse at Ascot, which is right next to the parkland at Windsor, as part of this formal welcoming to this important horse racing meeting. And here at the bottom you can just see the specific carriages that are used for Ascot, usually stop for a little water break before they go all the way down the racecourse. So you can see there the postilions in their Ascot livery and the Ascot landaus, and there's a group of 5 Victorian carriages that are specifically used for the Ascot race meeting. So the mews between London and Windsor consists of approximately 40 horses, 80 carriages, but that is the whole spectrum of carriage, from the Gold State coach to exercise brakes to landaus used by ambassadors. And a staff of about 53, along with 5 state cars, but fortunately we're not that interested in the combustion engine, so I don't have to talk to you about the technicalities of the cars. Recently, a lot of the trained carriage horses moved to Windsor. As I mentioned, it's a much quieter part of the... It's half countryside, it's quieter for the horses, and it's nicer for the staff living as well. So there are fewer horses permanently based in London than there were in recent years. And at Windsor, there's also more horses kept for private riding and private carriage driving. So, for example, the late Prince Philip's carriage horses were all kept at Windsor. They were never in London. London has always been very much for the ceremonial horses. Today, no stallions are kept, but until the early 20th century, they were used both as the carriage horses and also kept at the breeding paddocks at Hampton Court Palace, which still remain for the use of mares and foals, but there are no stallions owned by the royal family. The King names the horses, and so in the last couple of years we've had a new generation who are named after the natural world, which is one of his great interests, things like trees and plants. But before that, we still have quite a lot of the horses that were named during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. So they were often named after places she'd been or things she'd spotted. So, for example, Perth, here on the slide, was named after a state visit, an official visit to Australia. Daniel on the top right was a particularly popular horse, and I'll mention him again later. He was one of the horses that featured on this stamp, which was issued by the British Royal Mail. He posed for a sculpture that is on a roundabout in Windsor, and when he retired, he got a massive carrot cake and a party at the Mews in London. So the horses are divided into sets of 10. That has that has a historic precedent. We know it's been that way since at least the 18th century. Before that, we don't have great records, but from the 18th century to the present day, the records for the Royal Mews in London are very good. Practically every horse and every member of staff is recorded, so from a social history perspective, it's quite important. Many of the bays have Cleveland Bay bloodlines, but most of them are not purebred Cleveland Bays. That's a British breed from the north of England, middleweight horse, very good for riding and for driving. In the mid-20th century, it was extremely endangered. There was one registered stallion left, which Queen Elizabeth II bought and allowed other breeders access to try and re-establish the breed. It's still quite endangered, but the royal support for it has improved the breed situation. The greys that I mentioned are a 20th century type that are sought. A lot of them have Irish draft breeding, but really they are looked out for temperament and coat colour and suitability for coping with London streets rather than being a breed. And they replaced a type which is covered in the Cheval catalogue called the Hanoverian Cream, which died out in the early 20th century. So if you're interested in them, we can certainly talk a bit more about them in the book. So a list of the creams in the 18th century included the fact that all these horses were named. So they were called things like Poppet and Squeaker, despite the fact that they were very large and apparently quite aggressive stallions. So these are the types of horses on the bottom left of the screen you can see being schooled in the Buckingham Palace School. They were harnessed in pairs or fours or eights, depending on the royal carriage, but also used as outrider horses in processions. So horses positioned, as you can see on the right-hand side, with individual riders, which are still used in royal processions today. Originally, they would have kept the public away from the royal carriages, but now, of course, we have a much more sort of policed situation when the horses are out on the streets, and therefore the outriders are not particularly there for security, but they're still there for the sort of magnificence of the procession. Up on the top left, we have the two types that were used and are used at the Mews. There were German black stallions, the bloodlines of which came from Hanover in the 18th century when the British and Hanoverian crowns were connected. And these, as a dark coat colour, died out in the 20th century. And they were replaced by the bays. As I mentioned, a lot of them have Cleveland Bay breeding, but are not exclusively Cleveland Bay horses. And there is a mare and foal in the stables at Hampton Court, which is where the foals are kept. The Royal Mews, there is a couple of images of the Hanoverian creams before they died out. So Adonis at the top left was the riding horse stallion of George III, and he has a little entry in the exhibition catalogue. And on the bottom right, you can see 8 of the Hanoverian creams harnessed to the gold stagecoach. And we think this painting is the first use of the gold stagecoach, taking the king to Parliament in the early 1760s. But you can see that's the same coach as is still in very occasional use. So after the horses have reached the end of their working lives, if they are suitable for retirement, they go to a charity about 20 miles outside London, which was established for working horses. So it takes horses from the military, from the Royal Mews, and from the police, as well as some of the Riding for the Disabled charities. And they can live out their days maybe with their former stable mates, getting very muddy and rolling as much as they like. So here at the top we have Maryland, who retired after 15 years of service, and she is grazing happily in Buckinghamshire. And Meg was one of the wheelers, so she's one of the horses closest to the front wheel of the gold stagecoach at the coronation. She retired shortly after that, and she had done 15 years of service, so she is now also in her retirement paddocks. The Royal Muse employs both men and women in every position. It was an early employer in the household of women, including particularly for the schooling of horses for side saddle for consorts or young princesses. And here you can see one of the outriders before the coronation, and the coronation medal being pinned on one of our lady coachmen. She's wearing a coat and a tricorn hat and a wig that in style date from the 18th century. The red and the gold use, although the coat is 18th century in style, it's also the red and gold dates from the reign of Charles II in the 1660s, so the restoration of the monarchy after a brief period under Oliver Cromwell, where red and gold was chosen as the colours for royal livery. So although the coats themselves are newer and made by military outfitters when needed, they have a very long historic precedent. But of course, we don't wear the very fancy livery every day. It's not very practical. So on a day-to-day basis, all the staff are provided with much more practical and safe uniforms, steel toe-cap boots and so forth. And certainly for events like oiling your hooves, that is really needed. So just to tell you a little bit more about the different types of livery, we have liveries in the Muse. The oldest that are still in use were commissioned in 1919 for a parade following the First World War. But at the coronation, there was quite a few new liveries acquired. So when an old livery is retired, it would enter the Royal Collection and we would look after it as a historic object. But even some of those that are still in use are really quite old and refurbished when needed. So hanging up with their name tags on them, we have outriders and coachmen's uniforms, the frock coats on the top left. On the top right is an ascot livery with the old cipher for the Queen Elizabeth II, so they have all been replaced with new ciphers for the new king. And a postillion's livery is cut very short to the waist because they are riding the horses, so the frock coat would not be as compatible with that. At the bottom you can see a postilion, and it's a little hard to make out, but to avoid him crushing his leg, which is against the axle of the carriage, they wear reinforced boots on their inner leg, and ordinary, although very traditional looking, riding boots on the outside leg. There are a lot of other skills at the Muse, so most of the work is done in-house, and that's something that has been championed in the late 20th century when so many of these skills are being lost to us. So all the carriage cleaning and restoration happens in-house, with the exception of wheelwright work, which is outsourced to a company in the south of England. All of the harness work for historic harness takes place in-house, so that might include restoring a historic harness, it might include making new pieces to fit a new horse, and they work closely with livery companies in the City of London who sponsor their skills and their qualifications. And you can see at the top right the harness room. So although a lot of the harnesses are considered historic, because they are still working harnesses, pieces are replaced as they are needed. So most of the harnesses don't actually have a completely old set of leather, for example. One of the most common events that the Muse takes part in is about 50 to 80 credentials a year when a new ambassador to the UK, so an ambassador sent from another country into the UK, presents their credentials, their certificate perhaps, from their head of state to the king. And the option in Britain, which apparently makes Britain and Denmark, who also do this, quite desirable, is that you can have a carriage to go and see the king. So You have the choice, depending on your rank, to have a state landau or a semi-state landau. So one of these Victorian carriages will collect you from your ambassadorial residence, take you to Buckingham Palace and return you. And at the return, they do hide in the carriages some carrots and some champagne for you. So that is the special treat. The other event, and we're just about to have a state visit this December again, is usually about 2, maybe 3 a year, where a visiting head of state visits the UK at the request of the government. So it's usually a country that we're keen to talk to, or they are keen to talk to us. And so the last one was the Emperor and Empress of Japan, a relatively new reign. They were due to come in 2020, but that's obviously put off by COVID. And so they made it to London in 2024. And here you can just about see, if you can make out the white hats, is the Queen and the Empress of Japan in one of the carriages with postilions, Windsor Greys, and because it was good weather, the carriage hoods were down, which is always nice because the crowds on the Mall outside Buckingham Palace can see people much more easily. And they are being followed by part of the household cavalry, so part of the British Army. Those soldiers are otherwise armoured tank soldiers, but they have this other part of their role where they take part in state processions. Every year, the UK government starts a new parliamentary session, and to formally open that session, the King goes to Parliament and reads a speech saying what the Parliament is going to be debating. And this includes a very large carriage procession because different pieces of regalia have to have their own carriage. So at the top, you can see a coach called Queen Alexandra's state coach, which was built for her in the 1860s when she was still the Princess of Wales, and it's carrying the imperial state crown. Quite amazing in that it travels on its own cushion with its own couple of little guards. And then on the bottom is the 2 of the maces, which are the symbols of Parliament's authority, which are too large to fit in the carriage, so they travel with the heads of the maces coming out from the carriage windows. But this has happened for 200 or 300 years, and so far all has been well. The King goes to Parliament in a carriage, and here you can see him last year just leaving. So those are the Greys under one of the big towers of Parliament at Westminster, and he's just about to enter what is quite a new coach, a Diamond Jubilee state coach, which was delivered from Australia, a gift from Australia 10 years ago. As I mentioned, there is both the carriage and the car transport. So in a lot of royal processions, you might see both elements of the Royal Mews work appearing. And here, one of the lady coachmen is sitting up on the box seat, and it's obviously winter and it's quite cold. She's got her full winter coat on. The Mews has also looked after all of the official riding horses for ceremonial occasions. Most recently, Noble, who is the current ceremonial horse for the King, was a gift from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So there's still an element of horses being used as diplomatic gifts. But the Mews has also been home to several other generations. Burmese, who belonged to Queen Elizabeth II, I think is quite a well-known horse that the late Queen was very fond of. The Royal Mews is open to the public 9 months a year, 5 days a week. So if you come, we do not put on special shows, but the operation of the Mews would be seen by people. So there would be horses in the stables. There may be carriages on the move. Most days, the post is delivered by carriage between the London palaces, which is quite nice. And therefore, there are often pieces to see. And also activities for children. We find it's very popular with families to be able to see the horses and dress up as a groom and look at the carriages. Thank you very much for listening. I thought I'd just end on a couple of nice notes where the horses and the carriages are just returning to the Royal Mews. So the coronation on the left with some of the cars following on, and a coachman leading one of his bays back after the state opening of Parliament. Thank you.
Thank Thank you very much, Mrs. Good Sir. I propose that if you have questions to deliver immediately, because she can't stay with us. If you have questions, please. Est-ce qu'il y a un micro, mademoiselle?
Is there a microphone? Are there no horses for hunting around Windsor, or no hunting horses at all?
The king historically did, well, historically, it's not that long ago, the king did keep some horses for hunting at his house in Gloucestershire at Highgrove, but a lot of hunting has been banned in Britain, and there's quite a lot of political controversy about it. So although you can still drag hunt, the royal family don't do that anymore. So at the fox hunting ban, they stopped hunting on horseback, but he did it a lot as a younger man.
Yeah, I have a question for you. We were a bit talking about it yesterday. So what are the difficulties of keeping horses in such a big city as London today?
I'm not sure if you knew, but about a month ago, maybe more, in the news, there were a couple of cavalry horses that threw their riders in the middle of London and galloped quite a long way through the city. So that's just one incident where there's so much building work. It's a very busy part of London. And I think as well, an element where sometimes visitors don't appreciate that horses need a bit of space and time and don't necessarily shout at them, however well trained they are. And we've had as well, the area around Buckingham Palace, there is a very big central station and a very big amount of redevelopment. We've had a lot of skyscrapers built behind the palace, and that has added a lot to the noise and the busyness just behind the palace. So the decision was taken a year or two ago that it was just easier for everyone if more of the schooling happened outside London. But we still retain at least 2 or 4 horses at any one time in London, partly to deliver the post, and partly for sort of last minute carriage requirements, and they are rotated, those horses are rotated. And then obviously at busy times like Parliament or a state visit, there might be 50 or 60 horses all brought into London for that event.
D'autres questions?
Any other questions? There is still hunting, however, in the UK. I have an example of at badminton, for example, the Duke of Beaufort every year presents his hounds. Tony Blair had a law passed, but realised afterwards, and even writes in his memoirs, that he had made a mistake by doing so. So there is still some hunting. It's not. It has been totally stopped in the UK, and in France, some would like to do that, but we're keeping an eye on that and making sure they don't ban it.
Well, they banned hunting for a fox, but you can still trail hunt. You can follow a scent, an artificially laid scent, but the royal family stopped in 1997. They don't follow the artificial scent, which itself is now attracting quite a lot of protest. The following the artificial scent is becoming quite persecuted.
Bien.
Oui, c'est ce qu'on appelle les dragues, en fait. C'est-à-dire, il y a un...
It's, in fact, they lay the course beforehand with a rider who has a scent of a fox in a bag, or with fox droppings, who creates a circuit, in fact, and then they set the hounds off that can follow that scent, but it's nothing like real hunting. If there are no other questions, then in that case, we're going to pass on to our next speaker.
J'ai le plaisir maintenant d'accueillir
have Lecia Garcia, who is the curator of carriages and saddlery in Madrid, and who's going to be, and also a doctor in history, who's going to be talking to us about the horses and stables of the Patrimonio Nacional in the 21st century. So now we're talking about the equestrian history of yesterday and tomorrow. Thank you to all of you, to Mathilde Denis and Alain, to the Association of Royal Residences of Europe for the invitation. I will be giving my presentation in French. I apologize in advance. I'm going to do my best. The title is Horses and Stables of the Patrimonio Nacional in the 21st century. But I realized that if we want to understand the present, we also need to look to our recent past. So, what were these royal stables? They were one of the large functional departments of the royal house, modelled after the Burgundy fashion, and it was crucial for the royal functions, for practical reasons, for transport, for representation in public of the royal family, and it was a department in charge of running and providing the horses for each visit or trip or outing or festivity in which the royal family were taking part, also for hunting activities. And so it was also a very expensive activity, and the stables were there to make sure that always these activities were conducted with the necessary prestige and protocol that was defined. So who worked here? The staff grew constantly over the centuries. The stables encompassed dozens of professions and hundreds of professionals, headed by the Grand Equerry. A very important, prestigious position held by a member of the high aristocracy. But in Spain, there was no hereditary dimension to this. It was a position for a person of trust, a position that obviously was very close to the king and brought great influence. There was then a complex network of administrative departments divided into 3 divisions. One for the regalia, with the very finest horses for riding. Then there was also a division for the carriage horses. And finally, there was a division for mule-drawn carriages. There was also the saddlery activity, the arena, the picareros, the school for pages, the royal stud farms, and at certain times there was also the royal armory. So the number of employees kept growing continually, and at the end of the 18th century it reached a record 2,000 horses and 1,300 employees, but this figure was never reached again later. So where were the buildings? We can see them here on the slide. We will be focusing on the Royal Palace in Madrid, although there were similar areas in all the royal residences. At the Royal Palace in Madrid, this was the official center for ceremonies, especially after the destruction of the Palace of Buen Retiro. So there were stables. They were to the north of the Royal Palace and were designed by the Italian architect Francesco Sabatini. and they remained in service from 1782 to 1932, the fall of the monarchy, and when the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed. So what happened with the stables? The stables lost their purpose, and the buildings which had housed visitors had been operating as a museum since 1870 and were demolished in 1934 to make improvements to the urbanism of the city. And you have these buildings here which now occupy the site. The immense buildings here were demolished. And sadly, so the building was demolished, but the carriages and certain other objects were appreciated for their artistic riches and were kept with the idea of creating a museum, although that project was abandoned at the time of the Spanish Civil War. A large part of the carriages were sold off, and others were destroyed, and others went into storage. For the opening of a museum of carriages, for a museum of carriages to open, it was only in the 1960s that this happened. But to have an idea of the interior of Sabatini's Grand Stables, we do have some period images. And I've also included some pictures of the carriages from the beginning of the 20th century. This is the royal carriage, one of the most important coaches that we have in our collection. And here, Berlin, and here we have the saddlery, where we have harnesses, saddles on display to the public. Different models that were on display. And here we see some of the employees who worked there with their gala uniforms, their ceremonial postilions, coachmen, grooms. So the royal arena was indoors, but sometimes they would perform outside. Here we have the future Alfonso XIII. And here we can see him again, very young. As we said, the Carriage Museum ultimately opened in 1967 in the gardens of the Palace, the Jardines de Campo de Oro. So you can see here on postcards with hexagons, but there were structural defects on the building, which meant that it closed. You have views here of the interior of the Carriage Museum. It was very popular with a modern system, lighting system, and after that it closed and became a warehouse. And today we're really trying to get work done to open it up again. To present the collections so that they don't get forgotten. But there are still some objects, carriages, and also which are housed in what we call the royal stables, which are on the ground floor of the palace on the northern side. And between 2000 and 2005, renovation work was done here to bring the building up to modern standards. There is a floor area of about 4,000 square meters with office space, infirmary stalls, saddlery, and here you have a view of the interior, part of the stables. And here we see the staff who look after the horses each morning, clean them. And there are about 40 people who work here, headed by Carl, who is the royal equerry. And then we also have coachmen, vets, postilions, blacksmiths. To replace the shoes on the horses. And here we have an image of a horse. We have 16 horses today from Central Europe, also from Dutch and German, aged between 3 and 20 years old, with the priority being the preference goes to very elegant, large horses, powerful horses, which are more than 1.76 meters. And why do we want these stronger, more robust horses? There is a reason, which is that they can be as much as 800 kilos, and that's what we need for the sort of thing they have to do. They have to pull and slow down, also carriages which can weigh as much as 3 tons. And the carriages they draw don't have brakes, so it's the horses that have to slow them down. Here we can see the horse with the table, with the specific needs for feeding, medication, and the information that the staff need. Here there is a reminder, for example, that the hooves need greasing every Monday. So there is a very strict routine in the stables. Here we have a horse that was acquired recently, last year, because obviously the horses get old and need to be replaced. In 2023, we bought 2 horses, and we organized an Instagram campaign also to find horses. So we said that there's as I was saying, there's a very strict routine every day. They are taken out each day for 2.5 to 3 hours in the gardens to get them used to the noises, and also to take part in, so they can take part in events without being frightened. And here we can see the interior of the place where we keep all the gala ceremonial uniforms, most of which are new, but we are still reusing the buttons and stripes from historic uniforms. Here for the grooms, the feathers for the horses, also here with the lancers with the harnesses, and we're very attentive to the atmosphere and to the temperature in the building. The ideal is to have stable conditions, 18 to 20 degrees, and humidity of about, relative humidity of about 80%. And who works in the stables? In the palace, there are workshops with professionals who, many of whom are from families where several generations have worked here. Here, the people who work on the different pieces of equipment, the saddles and all the rest. And sometimes we do need to buy in equipment. Not everything is created on site. And for that, we do have the best craftsmen who are in Seville, in Andalusia. Here you have the most recent harnesses that were bought for 2 horses. And here you can see with the coat of arms of King Emeritus Juan Carlos. And there we talked about the crafts people who work here. Here we have Lucie Romayer, who works on gilding on the carriages and works on the painting, renovating the painting, and lacquer on the details of the carriages. And we also have carriages, ceremonial carriages, like this, which we call Paris coaches. They were all imported from Paris in the second half of the 19th century. Here you can see the interior, the opulent interior. And in the past, we would use more delicately designed carriages with their gilded panels, but today they're not really compatible with use in official ceremonies, such as the presentation of diplomatic credentials, which aren't just in Sweden or in the UK, but also in the Netherlands and in Spain, where the ambassadors pass through the center of the city. The new ambassadors travel to the Foreign Affairs Ministry by carriage on the Plaza Mayor, from the Plaza Mayor to the Plaza de la Armeria, to the Royal Palace, to present their diplomatic credentials with a squadron of the municipal police in the procession. With the grooms, coachmen, accompanying the ambassador into the palace. Here we see the ambassador arriving at the staircase of honor in the royal palace, and they also are used in other official ceremonies like funerals, of state funerals of an ex-president here in 2014, to say goodbye here to Adolfo Suarez, the first president of democratic Spain, and also to present our collections. The Carriage Museum that we mentioned earlier is still closed, but with the support of the Gallery of the Royal Collections last year, we organized an exhibition, En Movimiento, and we have some images here of the exhibition with carriages and other vehicles which are part of the collection, which you see being installed here. And thank you, and I hope to see you all come to visit us in Madrid, to visit the stables and our storage facilities. It would be a pleasure to play host to you there, and also to perhaps cooperate with you. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. After the demonstration for England, it does give us another insight into these royal courts with these carriages and these traditions, these professions, which we'll see again this afternoon in the different activities we'll be presenting, showing the different manual crafts activities. So this raises these questions of how we preserve and pass on these traditions and how we continue as things change and new practices, new activities arrive, new equestrian activities, and also we saw some examples there of the reintroduction of horses and the equestrian world in farming, as was mentioned this morning, and in vineyards. I noted that, but there are some other examples that could be given. So I think this raises a lot of questions for us in this first third of the 21st century. So I'm now going to allow some time for questions, because we are getting on there in time. Thank you for the presentation. Are there any questions you would like to ask there immediately about Madrid? Can we have the microphone over here, please? Excuse me. I had a question about the furnishings. Do we have virtual models of the interior and the fittings of the buildings, and does that exist or not? If I understood the question, it's whether we have models or mock-ups. No. I'm sorry, but we only have photographs and images showing the stables from the past. But have any 3D models been made on computers? Or there are some articles which describe, there have been articles which have been with descriptions of the different locations of the stables over the centuries. And also sometimes we do have images of the interiors, but we don't have a complete view of them. I wanted to say there have been archaeological digs also, because earlier there was the Cavallerizza in the garden of Sabatini, and there were things dating back to Philip II, so there were digs there which were conducted, and I think there probably are reports on those digs. That archaeological work was done before the opening of the Royal Gallery of the Royal Collections, which was a huge investment. And regarding that carriage museum, which is currently closed, what projects do you have? Is there a date scheduled? Or is there a project currently underway to reopen something on the carriages and equestrian heritage of the Royal Palace? That depends. That's a question it's a question of money, especially as we have money. There is money from the European Union, but obviously we have a royal foundation, palaces, all sorts of different sites, monasteries. So the opening of a museum has not been defined as a priority, but we are working on to try to make it a priority in the future. So they can reopen, but this is very specific work because there's questions of the specific lighting, the backlighting on the walls. It really was something which had been designed. I was lucky enough to see this when I was young. It really was something quite exceptional in terms of the presentation, and it was very, very popular, as you mentioned. But it was really very innovative at the time. But for what, obviously, I'm not a specialist on these things, but the technical side didn't keep up. This sort of thing, and a lot of investment would be needed to get it back into service. Just a question. Was there not a Royal Academy of Equestrian Art in Madrid? Because I know nothing about any such thing. With all the equestrian heritage you have, is there not a treatise on an equestrian treatise? Do you know anything about that? At the Royal Library, we have a manual with a description of royal parades. Because I think there were parades, because I know in Vienna, in Versailles, in Lisbon, there were academies, but we don't hear about an academy, because I want to know if you know something. But no, but there is nothing there, no. My question is more for the previous speaker, the British speaker. I would have liked to ask her to tell us about the Horse Trust. Which we saw in several of the photographs. Could somebody explain what that horse trust is? I am not competent to answer your question. She did mention it briefly she mentioned the fact it exists, but I don't have the information, and I'd like to take this opportunity to present the apology to Toby Hand, who would have talked about the Horse Trust, who couldn't be with us because of health reasons, unfortunately. I'm sorry for that, but thank you to Mrs. Goodser for stepping in and replacing him. But I'm sorry, I don't have that information for you about the Horse Trust. It would appear that it is a body that receives retired horses. That is what she mentioned, but I really can't say any more than that. I don't know what the status it has is. I know it's attached to the Crown, that these are estates developed by Prince Charles with his particular interest in animals, but I don't have the details. I wouldn't like to say something that might be wrong. Any other questions on Madrid or the previous presentations this morning? Sometimes we have questions that come to mind after the fact. If not, in that case, you will have this afternoon. I'm sure everybody will. There's a question over there.
Voilà. Je crois que c'est cette année.
So I think this year the city of Brussels decided to get rid of their horse carriages and to replace them by electrical carriages. Do you know why? What led to this decision? I don't have an official answer on this. I believe this is part of the current trend to use electricity. And actually, it would be interesting to cover this issue today because we're talking about the past up until today. So it would be interesting to see how this traditional heritage of carriages can continue to live with this new electrical identity. I don't have an official answer, but if somebody does, yes, please. 1 second, you're going to get a microphone. It's not about electricity, but rather animal usage of animals. So not using animals and not perform any type of entertainment with animals. You're right, but I think there's a bit of both. They could have. So it's really about animal well-being. Everything around hunting. It's true that we haven't covered those themes much in the symposium, but it's a political issue, and the defense of animals is behind the decision. Yes, that would for sure be an interesting theme. It's part of the reflection, indeed. Can I just comment on this? In the presentation around using horses in London, the presenter specified that the horses could be tired and bothered by the city, but that there was a change, 3 days in the city and 3 days in the countryside, which was done in Vienna. And Brussels could have also drawn some inspiration, find some meadows and or parks maybe. It was a private person who was managing it, and it was also an issue of logistics to keep the horses in city. There's an example in the Mont Saint-Michel, which is very interesting. In the Mont Saint-Michel, there's a team. There are 30 horses. Some are Percheron, others are Breton. Who help transport visitors every day. And it's very well structured. There are carriages with 2 horses, but none of the horses can take 2 return trips per day. But in some summer days, there's so many people that all the horses are mobilized. And they have a farm 3 kilometers away from the Mont Saint-Michel. They bring the horses in a big truck in the morning and get them home in the end of the morning, and then they're replaced by others for the afternoon. But it's interesting, an interesting example here in France, specifically in the Mont Saint-Michel. I'll mention another example because I initiated it with another person in charge for 12 years. And we used to have cars here in Versailles up until the 2007, from the 90s. And we had a carriage in the park with heavy horses, with benches, carriages, and it was an opportunity also to showcase the tradition and the trades. And we had a change in horses every 2 hours. Of course, with every 2 hours was the time for the ride, but it was an opportunity to showcase the equestrian practice. And we also had 2 other cars, Berlin, so It was an opportunity to showcase the know-how on horse carriages based on the history as it was done back then in Versailles. So I think this requires to have a reflection and to investigate, because there are expectations from the public. Back then it was quite popular. I won't say that there was a perfect balance. It was very difficult for the person in charge back then, Mrs. Levasseur, to find the right financial balance, but she managed. And it was an opportunity for many professional and craftsmen working in the equestrian world to continue this activity. Some changed careers, others went to the countryside, some continued in Paris for a while. It didn't last, but it continued for some time, and in cities like Versailles, one of them continued the activity in Versailles. One of the difficulties is to find the right financial balance, well-being of the animals, the know-how, the tradition, which takes time, and as you know, manufacturing costs are high. So it's always hard to find the financial balance, but it would be interesting because, and we know it here, there is demand. So the expectations around equestrian practices is here. What's difficult is to have the right financial means to maintain it. I'm sorry for speaking at length, but I defend the cause. Yes, maybe we should highlight that in the presentations we've heard over the past 3 days, I wasn't there on Wednesday, on using horses in those different applications, only the English provided a comprehensive presentation on recruitment, training the horse, and retirement. And they did it very naturally, as if the retirement was obviously something to present. And I believe that if everybody did this, the public would be less worried, because it feels like we don't know where the animal is going anymore. Suddenly it was used, it was trained for certain purposes, and then suddenly, what happens to it? And our British friends who pay very much attention to animal well-being presented with images in the meadows. It might be a bit of an ideal vision, but I don't think so. They have nice meadows and prairies, so I think that's an expectation from the public.
Ah oui, 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 oui. Eh ben, si vous m'aviez laissé finir, c'est ce que j'allais dire.
If you let me finish, I was about to say it. Yesterday, I asked a very uncomfortable question. I saw many people looking down to the floor, but the only representative of the Republican Guard was very clear on the future of the horses, and there was a round of applause, and she was the only one. Yes, absolutely. It's an important topic. We don't want to deviate from it, but as you saw, we have little time. We can touch on it, but I'm sure that the people here care about the future of the horses. That's the case of the horses here with the Academy. There is special treatment for the Bartabas horses after their career. They go to a prairie. I talked about Mrs. Vasser's horses earlier. All these horses retired as well in Normandy. They were used for different purposes. I talked about the activities and the urban services. So in all different services, be it at the court or current usage of horses, I don't doubt that there is a reflection on their usage and then their end of life. Here in Versailles, we have a simple example. We have an association welcoming animals who unfortunately were victims of bad treatment, and we welcome them here so that they can peacefully end their life. So there are solutions. I'm not saying the world is perfect, we all agree, but we need to pay attention to this, continue to lead actions, and when horse works for men, there must be a reflection on the preparation of their future so that they can end their life in dignity. This was covered yesterday. It was not part of the theme, which focused very much on the past and history, but in the discussion, and some of the speakers, including the representatives of Le Cadre Noir and the Republican Guard, touched on it. But that was not the main theme. It was one of the concerns. They highlighted it, but it was not the general theme, because it was up until the 19th century. I have another question, and I'm back to being a horse rider here. When will you open the entrance of the Ferme des Gallies to horses? Because there are 3 stables there. The horses would like to get back to the park and to have a wider area to ride the horses. We have reduced the circuit in terms of safety and maintenance, but there is a regular update of the program. You can check out the website. You have our contact detail, and we can let you know as the circuit evolves, because after the end of the Olympics, we will be able to extend the equestrian circuit again in Versailles. And since we decided to organize those days, the point is for everybody to be able to ride their horse in the Versailles Park, which will be pleasant for everybody, including the public. A comment about the animal welfare movement. Because although they want the horses to be happy, if we don't use them, it's a way to end or put an end to the financial interest of using horses. This might be controversial, but prohibiting eating horse meat is leading to the disappearance of different types of horses. So ultimately, the result is the opposite of what they're trying to get. You are right. Eating horse meat is also a debate, and this must be done under control, which does not mean that we should completely get rid of it. We agree. And you are right in highlighting this. This must be a reflection relying on the economy of the industry, how to strike the financial balance to allow for equestrian life to continue and be sustainable. That's why we wanted to focus on the past and the present. We don't have the same financial balance because we don't use the equestrian world in the same way anymore, but I think there's still a lot to do while respecting everyone's expectations. Yes, and the regulation of the usage of horses from a timeline perspective makes no sense. It must be based on the daily training of horses. A few hours trotting or galloping is completely different. So we should not be trapped in a poorly designed regulation. Who has the microphone? Yes, please. Yesterday was not the theme of the round table, animal well-being. We just touched upon it. However, I didn't have a chance to say it yesterday, but the Portuguese horses, as soon as they enter the stables, get the best care possible with colleagues from the university hospital, and They get weighed every 2 months, and at the end of their career, once they go to the stud farm, they go back to where they were born. We have included the option of having somebody working in the school, the groom or other team members can either stay with the horse. Through a protocol, they cannot take care of the horse, then they get back to the stud farm in a paddock until their death. So they have a nice end of life. They have a good, useful life, and then a retirement. Thank you very much. I think this will be the conclusion. We need to leave the auditorium. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and we can continue this afternoon together, this time in the Great Stable, starting at 2:30. Thank you.